You didn't kill Anakin Skywalker. I did.
Well, I guess I'm off the hook then now, aren't I? In this video, I'll be showing you how to make Darth Vader's armor, against which there is only one defensive strategy. That ought to do it. For this build, I use craft foam or floor mat foam, 2mm foam, super glue, hot glue, contact cement, or just contact cement, or just hot glue, or just super glue. You know, whatever you have on hand. Cutting tools, sanding tools, safety gear, scissors, razor pens, and a box cutter. First, I'm gonna dig out the template from my alien costume because it's very similar to Vader. Since this makes it a new template, there will be a link to that in the description down below. I happen to be using floor mat foam for this just because it photographs better before it's painted. But if you're specifically trying to make the Vader armor, then I'd recommend using craft foam for the whole thing because he's got a lot of layered armor plating on top of the shoulder portion, and it may look too bulky depending on your proportions in comparison with famed English strongman and terrible secret keeper David Prowse. Then I traced that to foam floor mats, taking care to include the registration marks, those little triangles. Those will be instrumental in helping me line up the edges. I weighted the floor mats down with machinist blocks so the foam doesn't slide around while I'm working. I cut those out with the work knife, which I continually sharpened in order to keep the cut clean and uniform. I'm also being careful to make sure that my blade is angled perfectly straight up and down. This will prevent any ridges or depressions from forming in the foam after I join the two sides. I smoothed it out even more on the belt sander. When you sand, you'll get these little fuzzy flash pieces on the edge, so be sure to peel those off, otherwise they're just going to create a mess when you try to glue. Next, I heat formed the pieces using my heat gun. When it was sufficiently heated up, I pressed it over half of a giant novelty Easter egg that I'm using as a planishing iron, or anvil, to help shape the foam into a curved piece, and then repeated the process. Rolled it up and stuck it into a cylinder transparent for your benefit. When it cooled, I glued the edges together. Here's a quick shot of all the pieces before I take them over to the gluing station. Oh, and just so there's no confusion, this is only half Vader armor. To get the other half, I flipped the template over and repeated the steps that I just showed you. Next, I contact cemented them together. I wear a respirator while doing this because the fumes aren't great to breathe. I just want to show you what half looks like before I glue them both together. Then I applied super glue to the seam and folded it in. You want to be careful when using super glue on EVA foam because it generates a lot of heat as it dries. And foam, being an insulator, will concentrate that heat. And if you're pressing against the seam, you can get teeny tiny seam-shaped second-degree burns. I glued the halves together. In the past, I've left the back seam open so that I could get out of the suit easier, but since this is just shoulders, I can get away with gluing this shut as well. Now that it's all together, it's a little lumpy, just from the initial heat forming process. But don't worry, because by reheating it up partially, all of those lumps will just even right out. But it won't go completely flat again, because the glue seams are holding it in that shape. Now, you can already tell if the neck is too high, which means I'm gonna have to cut this down and then translate that change onto my old templates. See, part of the inspiration for this build is that a lot of Vader cosplayers were trying to use my generic shoulder template to go with the Vader helmet that I made, and the generic template doesn't quite match up. It's a generic thing. It's not necessarily one size fits all. It's more of from one size you can make adjustments to get it to fit all. And to first time cosplayers, it's not always straightforward. It's a lot of extra work that they need not have to deal with. So I just thought I'd make it easy for them, starting by trimming down the neckline. Once that was cut down, I had to modify the chest plate. It's got to cover a lot more of the chest than my original pattern, so I'm going to need to add another foam panel just beneath it. I used this piece of scrap foam that was actually initially a failed Stormtrooper helmet brim. I don't remember which. I've built so many Stormtrooper helmets, guys. It's a rather large piece, and it was partially heat formed in a way that happens to fit the armor, so I thought it'd be perfect. First, I taped it in with duct tape. Then I traced the seam that it would have to line up with, removed it, cut along my trace line, cleaned it up a bit with the rotary tool. After I was certain that it would line up, I cut the square edge at the bottom into a curved edge. That was better, but it still needed a lot of refinement before I got it right. See how much smaller that is? Probably could have used a smaller piece of scrap foam, but I don't mind, I think it worked out. I mean, what else was I gonna use that for? Another Stormtrooper helmet? Don't say it, don't jinx it. There's always new variants. Next, I reheat formed it to give it a more three-dimensional curve. When I was satisfied with the shape, shape, I glued it on with super glue. Now that the shoulders are done, it's time to move on to the details. I'm going to use 4mm craft foam for the raised portions, but for the wider recessed portions, I'm going to cut up some gray 2mm craft foam to cover up the seams on the interior. See, the original Star Wars costumes were all vacuum formed, so this was all like one piece of plastic that was heated up and stretched over a solid buck. But for that to work, I'd have to double my vacuum forming capacity, and those aren't necessarily household tools, you know? So, foam, that's much easier to come by than vacuum forming supplies. But also, the alternating colors so that I don't have to paint. If you can find foam that's the correct color to your final product, then you don't have to paint, and people will still get what you're going for. It will save you so much time. But if you're in a hurry to do your build, consider not painting. You'll save so much aggravation. If you do have the time, then you should paint, however, with gloss black acrylic, if anyone was wondering. But for the purposes of this video, you guys don't need to sit and watch paint dry, you know? We always get to that portion of the video and it's time-lapse, and I have nothing to say over the time-lapse, aside from paint it black 3 times over. Insert Stones music that I can't afford the rights to. Probably pick out that riff. Nah, the algorithm would pick up the riff. When I was sure of the shape and length, I made duplicates for the other shoulder. You have to be patient with super glue and wait, between a few seconds and a few minutes. But that's not nearly as patient as you would have to be with hot glue or contact cement. So, it's much more convenient in my opinion. This is what it looks like with all the ridges. You can segment the shoulder pauldrons if you want to. However, it's only necessary if you plan on lifting your arms higher than a force choke hold. Basically, if you're doing New Hope Vader, leave the shoulders attached. If you're doing Rogue One hallway scene, separate them, because he's gotta lift his arms high to kill all those rebels. Gotta think about these things. In fact, after I do the test fitting, which really is what the beauty shots of the videos are, essentially a test drive before I take them out to conventions. Okay, now I would love to call this done, but we've got a few problem areas still. This got kind of gnarled. I'm gonna have to clean that up with the rotary tool, and I got these really obvious seams. Then I cut the gray strips to fill in the gaps, because he's got this alternating pattern going on. Also, I don't want to have to putty the seams. I made this whole thing about the paint job a few minutes ago, but really, if I had to putty those seams, that would add a couple more days to the build. And I mean, you could do it, it's an option, but I don't think it's necessary, I folded them over the edges and glued them to the inside, just to hide the rough edge of the thicker 3/8 foam, but that's just a personal choice. Then I sanded some of the rough spots that I couldn't hide quite as easily using my rotary tool. I also did some more heat forming because I feel like the back of the neck is slouching a bit. I mean, I did take this pattern off of myself, so what does that say about my posture? That I need to work on it. Vader does have this very, superhero, like anti-Superman, Christopher Reeves, Jonathan Frakes type posture. The guy's a bodybuilder, what do you expect? Acting's not just reading lines, basically a workout routine. Lastly, I did a poor man's paint job by heat sealing it. This will give it a little bit of a shine and cut down on the number of layers that I'll need to add when I do eventually paint it. Just don't go too long on the 2mm stuff because it will quickly deform and burn. And we're done. Wait, hang on. I messed up. These are supposed to be black. So just... problem solved. I made new ones, inserted them, and that was it. Well, I mean, it's part of a whole costume that you gotta put together. But I already built the helmet in one of my other tutorial videos, so that was done. And the robes are just basic Sith robes you can get anywhere, but they get the job done. After much tailoring, I don't want to recommend these Sith robes because I had to do so much extra tailoring on these to get them. I'm complaining, but this is the sort of tailoring that you can do while watching TV, so... Oh no, I get to binge It's Always Sunny while making Star Wars robes. What an inconvenience. And now I can cosplay as the world's worst father.
I don't think he'll want this back. A lightsaber? You got you a lightsaber? Of all the irresponsible parenting decisions,
says the absentee father.
You didn't even tell me about it.
And besides, you didn't have to cut off his hand.
How I choose to raise my children is my own business.
Oh, Darth. One's a Sith and the other's a Jedi. What happens when they become roommates? It's your turn to take out the garbage. And now it's also your turn to do laundry. on Fox. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this build, then you can subscribe and hit the bell icon to see future prop builds. Once again, I'd like to thank my patrons. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can check out the links in the description down below. Anything pledged goes towards improving the video quality, prop functionality, and shop equipment, and allowing me to put together bigger and more exciting projects for you to enjoy on the channel. Let me know what you'd like to see me make in comments down below. Happy crafting. See you later. They're roommates, despite everything. Oh boy. And also the glasses. Well, I think Kenobi would be using wearing glasses to do close work. Oh, and you didn't have to cut off the boy's hand, by the way. This just sounds like a really, really flamboyant Kenobi. Well, isn't that convenient? That's so Stewie Griffin. Well then, I guess I'm off the hook. God, you are in there. Again with the face recognition software. You mean you don't recognize EVA foam?